This morning, let me invite you to turn in your Bibles to the book of Ruth. We're going to be looking at the book of Ruth. If you missed last week, I highly encourage you to go check it out. All of our series are online on our YouTube channel. You can pull it up on the app because we're doing this in two parts. If you missed last week, it's a great opportunity to go and check it out. But here's kind of the premise of what we're talking about. We're taking 8 weeks to walk through the book of Ruth. Now, you're thinking, well, I think there's only 4 chapters in there. Well, we're kind of looking at the story, the content of a chapter in 1 week, and then we're delving a little bit more into the concepts that it raises for us in another. Now, we talked about Ruth, and one of the keys of the book of Ruth is that in some ways it mirrors the book of Job. And in some aspects, Naomi, who I will argue is probably the principal character of the book, is kind of a female version of Job, dealing with the challenges and the tragedies of life and trying to make sense of it all, trying to see God in the story, which is conspicuously absent. God is not mentioned very often in this story at all. And if it is, it's kind of in the context of a blessing or maybe a prayer. There isn't a grand theological lesson that's stamped on the front. It actually becomes an invitation for us to journey alongside Naomi and Ruth and Boaz and the other cast of characters and try to come to this place where we go, how do we see God in all of this? How is God going to show himself in such a story where it seems like so many things go wrong? And that's really a valuable lesson for us. And I'm going to kind of tip my hand here a little bit. I want to engage this from a pastoral perspective because how we embrace or how we react to tragedies in our lives will make or break you. To have a faith that can overcome the difficult, to have a faith that can overcome the unknowns, to have a faith that can withstand the unanswered question of why. And I have to say, it's really, really hard to do that when you are in the midst of tragedy yourself. It's like a certain part of your brain almost shuts off and we're left kind of stumbling around and not sure what to do. And so I want to ground us. I want to equip us. And for those of you who are here and you trust in Jesus, I'm believing that this journey alongside with Ruth is going to help you endure and possibly even to thrive. And if you're somebody who goes, hey, I just walked in, I saw free coffee, I don't know, it was cold outside, I'm not a Christian, I'm really glad you're here. This is a fantastic place to explore faith. I think that there's an important lesson here for you as well. Because the truth is, all of us face tragedy. Even if you have kind of that, gilded life where everything seems to work out, last time I checked, the death rate is 100%. And at some points, the body starts to break down. At some points, you end up going into care or into the hospital for the last time. See, we all face challenges. We all face tragedies. The question is, how do we think about that? How do we respond to it? Last week, we talked about how tragedy is inevitable. Don't waste it. This week, I want to talk about, from a slightly different perspective, tragedy is actually kinetic. Tragedy is kinetic. Don't ignore it. Tragedy creates this situation in us where all of a sudden we become awash with a series of emotions. One of those emotions that we experience is grief. Now, grief can look a whole bunch of different ways. People imagine it's kind of the ugly cry. Grief could look like sarcasm. Grief could look like being numb. Grief can look a whole lot of different ways. But that grief is going to go somewhere. The tension we feel, the pain that we feel is going to have a movement to it. Some of us, we bury it deep down because it's got to go somewhere. Some of us, it gets pushed out to all those around us and we're kind of lashing out or we're clinging. Or for some of us, it goes upward. And there's this anger, this bitterness that develops towards God, others in the situation in which we find ourselves. I tell you, what's not really an option is to experience tragedy, to experience grief, and go, well, I'm not going to deal with that, right? I'll just choose not to react to this. It doesn't work, friends. It's kinetic. It's going to go somewhere. And one of the worst things that we can do is silo it or shove it down. What I love about Ruth is it's an invitation to not ignore it. And as we journey through with Naomi, we stand alongside her as she's grieving. It kind of allows us to do a bit of a practice run ourselves, or to maybe even reflect on how this has taken place in our lives. Now, the number one thing that happens, this is almost 10 out of 10 times, when something bad happens, there is one question that rises to the surface. It bubbles up, and that question is, why? Why? It's surprising almost, even when the answer seems patently obvious. Maybe it's pretty clear why something happened. The why still comes up. In fact, sometimes the why doesn't seem to really even matter. It's not going to help us make a decision on the go forward, but we find ourselves stuck with this question, why? Now, let's just pause and question the why for a moment. Why do we need to know why? Have you ever wondered that? Why is it that even if you haven't done counseling with those who've been in a situation, maybe you yourself, haven't delved too deeply in that, you haven't experienced a ton of tragedy yet in your life, I'm really thankful for that for you. But even if you haven't, when I ask the question, everybody in the room knows what the answer is. We all ask why. Let's question that for a moment. See, your brain, the way God has designed you, is to be a meaning maker. We are meaning makers. Your brain is constantly trying to interpret the world around you. In fact, your brain needs an interpretive grid. Your brain needs to create meaning just like your lungs need oxygen. It's instinctual. When something happens, we get to this paralyzed place where the brain feels overwhelmed, where we're not sure what to do, and the only coherent thing that we can pull together is to say, why? Now, beneath that, I don't think the why is really about the why. You know how I know that? You can answer the why. And friends, people don't care. Because that's not really what they're asking. That's how they verbalize it. That's how the brain comes up with it in the moment. But what we're really trying to do is to make meaning of something, to make sense of something, to make meaning of something, to frame it in a way that somehow helps you get unstuck or move forward or to process the grief that's happening. It comes out in a couple different ways. There has to be a logical component to it, because that's half of our brain. But then there needs to be an emotive part to it. This is why I mentioned a story last week of 3 separate people in 1 week's time, all saying, my fiance, we're 6 months from getting married, and they just told me they don't believe in God anymore. And if you could just do like a quick last-ditch effort and save them, Brian. And so I sit down with these 3 guys. They didn't know each other. I didn't know any of them. Bizarre situation. And in 3 separate occasions, in a 2-week time period, they all sat across from me and said, well, Brian, here's why I don't believe. How could a good God allow bad things to happen to good people? Fresh out of philosophy classes. I gave them a logical answer. And I mean in the discipline of logic. I didn't hear a wild eruption of amens or, cheers or anything. That's exactly what the response is. People go, okay, thanks, which is a code for saying that wasn't helpful, but I'm being polite, okay? There's 2 sides of this. When we make meaning, there is kind of this logic side that does need to be addressed, but there's this other side too. Today I want to talk about that. Last week, the challenge was simply to face it. It's got to start with this honest, open-handed facing of these tough questions. By the way, that's a good model whenever you're having these struggles of faith, these doubts of faith. Sometimes people are a little embarrassed if they want to acknowledge to me and say, well, I've actually had these doubts or concerns, or I don't understand how this could work. I love those questions because the truth is that this book and the thousands of years of amazing men and women who followed God have some really good answers for whatever questions are out there. The odds of you questioning something that no one's ever thought of in the stream of church history is pretty low, and God's not afraid to engage with those. So it has to start with us just having this acknowledgement that God has allowed things to happen in my life that were tragic. I got to face that. I can't ignore it. But this week I promised you a little bit more of an apologetic, a little bit more of the logic behind it, to talk about the so-called problem of evil. But let me talk about where this comes from in our text here today. We walked through all of the text last week, but if you look in Ruth chapter 1, Ruth is going on her journey here, and she is Naomi and her husband go on a journey. They go to the land of the Moabites because of a famine that's happened. And when they get there, tragedy strikes. We really don't know exactly what happened, but all of a sudden, Naomi's husband and her 2 sons pass away. 10 years have passed, and now it's Naomi, a widow and a grieving mother, and her 2 daughter-in-laws who are grieving themselves. And she says, I'm going to turn back and I'm going to go back home. May God bless you, and may your life continue and thrive here in Moab. One of those daughters goes back to her people, back to her tribe. But Ruth says, I am going to cling to you. Your God will be my God. Your home will be my home. I'm committing my life to walking alongside you. And in this tearful moment, they start to head back to town. Now, we covered this last week, so this is the fast version. But I want you to see a little bit of how the text is dealing with this here. Ruth is actually a really well-crafted, from a literary perspective, book. Everything is really in tight couplets or chiastic structures. How each chapter starts, you'll notice, is very consistent over each chapter. Where it ends is consistent. The very beginning, the very end, it's really crafted in a beautiful way. So I'll point to just some of this for a moment. As they're coming back at the end of chapter 1, they're heading towards Bethlehem. Then they enter the town. They cause a stir. There's the center of the text here, what's kind of the main key point. They go back out of the town and back out from Bethlehem to prepare for the harvest. And the way that the text is going, these parallelisms are kind of drawing you to this central question. Okay, well, what is that? Well, when they come into the first 1b, when they come into the town, people go, whoa, wait a minute. Wasn't that Naomi? Who is that? Who is this person? It's been 10 years. Now, this isn't a mega metropolis. This is a village. There's a group of people here. Everybody knows each other. You grow up with the same exact people, okay? So people moving is not a very common thing in this time and era. And so it's very obvious when someone comes back into town, there's probably not that many visitors, and then they go, who is that? That sets up the central premise of the question. Who's this Naomi? What's the identity here? Now, listen how Naomi responds to this. She says, do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. That's a deep irony. She left Bethlehem in the first place with a husband and sons and dreams and hopes. She left with a full life, but an empty stomach. That's why they moved, famine. Now she's coming back with food, but the rest of her life is emptied out. And she says, God has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? This idea of the Almighty, El Shaddai. She uses more than just the generic term for the Lord or Yahweh. She specifically points to the Almighty. Now, if this were children's church, I would say, what does Almighty mean? That God can do I was going to say all the mighty things because it was a word play, but that's all right. You got the idea. God can do all the mighty things, right? What does it mean? God has power to do anything. And from Naomi's perspective, what did God use all that mighty power to do? To allow tragedy in her life. In fact, she personalizes it. She not only views that God allowed this to happen in her life, she actually says God is the cause. Not simply the one who permitted, but the one who enacted. He is the Almighty. He's dealt very bitterly with me. The Almighty himself has brought calamity on me. Something has turned sour in her soul. Tragedy and grief become kinetic, and it's something that doesn't just sit, it's something that doesn't go away, it goes somewhere. And if we're not intentional with how to process it, how to direct it in a healthy way, it's going to come out in different ways. And for her, it went up. And she went, you know what? Famine, illness. You know who actually shoulders the blame on this? The Almighty. The one who had the power to do something different. She personalizes and her soul becomes bitter. The question, who is this person? Her name, which previously meant pleasant, now she says, who I am, who I see myself as, bitter. So bitter. She raises this question, and in fact, this is why this book is so relevant for us today, because it's the same question that those three guys asked me at a lunch at Hop Dotties. There's the same question that people throw up all the time on Reddit or some other thing, and it sounds like this. How could an all-powerful, all-loving God allow for evil and suffering? And the idea here is that these must be inconsistent with each other. They must be incompatible with each other. By the way, just raise your hand if you've ever heard some form of this question before. All right, this is the most common question. If ever someone says, I'm struggling with faith, this is about the most common question that I get. How could an all-powerful, all-loving God allow for evil and suffering? And the logic pattern goes like this. Is he not able to stop it? Well, then he wouldn't be the Almighty. He wouldn't be all-powerful, would he? Is he unwilling to stop it? Well, then it seems like he wouldn't be that loving. And here's kind of the damning evidence at the very end of it. Maybe he doesn't exist. And this whole idea of some sort of daddy God in the sky sort of a thing, give me a break. We become bitter. And these people who started this walk of faith, maybe genuinely, maybe just by association, tragedy strikes. They don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to frame it or how to process it. And it's like their soul becomes embittered. In some respects, the book of Ruth is a story about how to heal a caustic soul. If you found yourself nodding along with Naomi and going, yeah, I think I'm bitter. Maybe you still have belief in God like Naomi, you're just pointing a finger. Maybe you've kind of gone, I don't know that this thing even exists. I want you to know there's a path of faith for you. This is a book on how to heal a caustic soul. Now, let me frame this. This is going to be a little bit more heady this week. Let me frame this in 3 categories that we're going to walk through. Possible, probable, and meaningful, okay? That's why this discussion covers different sections of our mind here. There is what is logically possible, which is a much broader category than most people assume. There is what is probable or most likely to happen. That's a separate discussion in and of itself. And then, frankly, here's what most people are here for. But what's meaningful? So let's talk about possible, and I'll frame it this way. Technically speaking, anything is possible. Anything is possible. To deny that would be to assume that you have access to the entire body of knowledge, to all evidence at all time, to be able to say conclusively what is not possible. That in and of itself, no one can do. So possibility is limited only by the imagination. Let me frame it this way. If I have my book bag in the back of the car parked out there, and I go out from the office one day and the window's shattered and the backpack's gone, okay? It is technically possible that the backpack suddenly became sentient and decided, you know what? I don't like this Brian person. I'm out of here. And so it smashes the glass and it goes away. And you go, well, Brian, that's ridiculous. But you would have to watch all backpacks at all times throughout the entire world to even start to say that couldn't be possible. You go, well, we could look at evidence, like was the glass broken in an outward fashion? Was it broken in an inward fashion? But you see, backpacks could be smart. And after they break the glass outward, they could go and slowly piece it back in on the seat of the car to kind of cover up the evidence, right? It could be a whole backpack conspiracy. Technically, that is possible. Now, what most people mean by possible is probable. But is that likely? Well, no, that's absurd. Okay, we've got no evidence or no reason to believe that, but it is technically possible. And for the conversation of logic, that distinction is going to really matter, okay? So the distinction matters. Let's talk possibility for a moment. When people say, how could an all-loving, all-powerful God allow evil and suffering in the world? That question in and of itself is not incoherent. That is not incoherent. There's nothing in those two statements that make it impossible for them to be next to each other. Why? Because what people really mean is something underneath. There's a more clear premise that we intend by what we say. Let's be clear about what those premises are. Okay, premise number one, this is what we're really saying. If God is all-powerful, then he can create any world that he wants. That's what we mean by saying, well, if God's all-powerful, we are making an assumption that if God is all-powerful, he can create any world that he wants. Here's the question. Is that necessarily true? And the answer, friends, in the realm of possibility is no. The answer is no. Why? Well, there's this idea. Here's an explanation to that. By the way, there's multiple. Only one needs to be possible for this whole situation to melt away. There's no problem of evil. Here's an example of how Christians have talked about this. Because God gave humanity free will. Why? Because God wanted you to freely respond to him, not in a robotic way. God wanted a genuine worship, not someone who was forced to do exactly what they were said to do and forced to say exactly what they were forced to say. That requires free will. In fact, a lot of moral things that we do require the freedom to do it. Many of our virtues that we hold require the freedom to say no to it. Otherwise, it's not a virtue. So this idea that God would only create a world in which his will was always done is simply not always true. You could conceive of a world where you say, well, because of free will, if that was God's intention, it must include space for people to reject, deny, and go their own way. If that's the case, so you kind of flip it on its head and go, if you're questioning, could an all-powerful, all-loving God allow evil and suffering? I would say what you're actually asking is, if God was all-powerful, wouldn't he create a world in which his will is always done? I think there's a very clear situation where the answer is no. Can you unequivocally argue otherwise? If we kind of shift the burden of proof here to the one speaking, can you logically argue that this is de facto impossible in any scenario? Pretty hard to do. Here's the second premise that we actually mean when we say these words. If God is all loving, then he would create a world without suffering. That's the implicit thing of what we're saying when we say this. That's the actual argument on the table. If God is all loving, then he would choose to create a world without suffering. Is that necessarily true? The answer is no. It's not. And here's an example of this. Any doctors in the room? We have some doctors in the room here. I'm looking at some who aren't raising their hands. That's okay. You don't have to participate today. Hey, we have some doctors in the room, right? Going to the doctor's not fun. Getting a shot's not fun. For our dentists in the room, it's not pleasant. There are plenty of things that we put up with. There are pains that we take on because there is a greater good to it. Most people will extend a moral argument to say, if there's a situation where you have to pick and choose, and either one individual dies or 100 individual dies, we're going to allow the one to die in order to preserve the 100. Most people can intuit this. They go, well, that's kind of obvious. You're just making the best case scenario. Okay? The greater good argument. So is it necessarily true that if God is all loving, he would de facto create a world where there was no pain or no suffering? And the answer is no. There could be a situation where actually a greater good is developed because of the pain and suffering. We see that in our own lives. We see that on a very human realm. That simply could be the case for God as well. Now, again, we're not saying that's exactly what it is. For the purposes of logic, we're simply saying if there is one solution, then the whole thing's not incoherent. So God doesn't necessarily require everyone to do his will. God doesn't necessarily compromise a heart of love by allowing for suffering or tragedy. So, if you really want to press this point, you would have to satisfy the burden of proof. You would need to argue that free will is impossible and a world without suffering is better. You would have to argue without exception that these things are both true for there to be a problem of evil. And I think the answer is clearly that burden of proof becomes overwhelming. There's no one, by the way, who's successfully done that. In fact, the whole problem of evil has by and large, by any serious philosopher, Christian or otherwise, said this is really not a logical problem. There really is too tight of a case for it to be a true problem. So you may go, okay, well, let me shift from possible and let me go back to probable for a moment, because the burden of proof for possible is simply unattainable here. Anyone who says that's not possible is just frankly wrong. But what if I kind of step it back? I'm just saying, okay, I'm not saying it's not in some form, some way possible. What if I just don't think it's likely? What if, in fact, God could say, you know what, even though it's not logical and it doesn't make sense, I'm going to create a world where there's somehow still free will, but everybody does what I say, and that somehow everybody has the best things that happen to them, and I still love them. Can't God just do the illogical? Well, of course he could, but then the problem, the logical problem of evil disappears because God can do whatever he wants. Right? However you want to frame this, however you want to frame it, the truth of the matter is that the logical problem of evil is simply not a problem. It's really not. The logical problem of evil is simply not a problem. And so here's me talking with these three guys. Well, I wonder, how could a good God allow bad things to happen to good people? I go, well, prepare yourself, friend, for some logical fun here. Because here's really what your premises are that you're working with. Here's why in the vacuum of possibility, it's simply not true. And you know what? You might feel a little silly about this, but frankly, there's no serious philosopher who believes this is a problem. This is gone. Everyone goes, yeah, that's really not a problem. The only people are like keyboard warriors who are like, Christians, but what about the problem of evil? Like the people who haven't thought about it are the only people who think that this argument still holds water. And so, friends, go forth and be blessed. And you know what they said? What you're saying. Okay, thanks. Okay, thanks. Why? For most of us, the why isn't really about the logic side of it. I do want to present that to you so that you can know and feel confident in the fact of this really isn't a question. It's really not. And there's plenty of, you could look at William Lane Craig, you could look at Plantinga, Alvin Plantinga, some really amazing thinkers on this. In the world of logic, this has all been proven. There's very few people in the world of logic, and most of them aren't fun, okay? But just know it's there in case you want to look at it. But here's where the rubber meets the road for us. We live in a culture that demands an absolute morality without an absolute lawgiver. We are in a world that currently is demanding what morality looks like, what good looks like, what bad looks like. This is always right. This is always wrong, right? If you're just watching the news, the amount of moral stances that are being held in an absolutist sense, it's not just my perspective, my country, my culture. In fact, if anybody does this in any country around the globe, it is de facto immoral because we just all know this is immoral. The problem with this is, if you remove God from the conversation of the world, I believe, it's very convincing, you actually have no absolute morality anywhere. This is why I believe, actually, that the problem of evil can become I love the conversation today. I'm a little bit of a better pastor than I was then. I love the conversation about the problem of evil because in some ways, I think it actually becomes a great conversation to point to God. To sit there and go, hey, we had this experience in the world where we have this gut sensation that things are wrong. Where does that come from? Where is this latent morality if there is nobody who enforces the rules and fairness like children? Nobody. If you ever want to cause ruckus in like a Sunday school class, you put 5 goldfish in front of one kid and 1 in front of another. And people, the room is going to come unglued, right? Who taught them that? There's something in us. Where does that come from? Even the fact that we go, evil is a problem, evil is wrong, that's a moral stance. Where does it come from? See, in our culture, we say, well, I mean, there's these things that are always right and always wrong, regardless of who does them and when it happens and where it happens. I will argue, if you remove God, a divine lawgiver, who sets a morality for all creation, then there is no absolute morality. It doesn't mean there's not a morality. Lots of groups and cultures come and they say, well, this is what I believe is right, or we all voted, morality is by democracy. We all decide what's good and what's bad, and that's how we choose to live. Or maybe we take it from a naturalist view, a utilitarian a la Mill view, whatever is best for the culture, maybe a Kantian view. Well, how we would do things of a first principle. There's lots of different ways to think about it, but at the end of the day, it's just a group of people deciding what they want to do. See, we have an ever-shifting cultural standard, but you've still got this latent problem of oughtness, is what they call it. I have not been in any culture, and friends, I have been in some of the most remote places. I'll tell you a story later about being dropped in the jungle in Papua, Indonesia. Crazy, talking with a tribe that had, until the previous generation, been cannibalistic. I mean, I have been in some really middle of nowhere places. I have never been in a place where someone can abuse a child and a group of adults standing around all feel like it's okay. There's this problem of oughtness, of this, certain things just feel wrong, and it cuts across culture and it cuts across time. It doesn't mean there's not people who don't harden their consciousness to it. It doesn't mean that there's not bad actors. It doesn't mean that you don't have people with mental impairments that change how they, but just in general, there's some things that we have all felt. Where does that come from? If God does not exist, I don't think absolute morality exists. And in this sense, I think Nietzsche was right. And Nietzsche, he was the one who, we can go to the next slide here. He was the one who says, God is dead. Nietzsche's argument was, if God is dead, then there really is no morality. It's just whoever has the power. And he really disliked Christianity because he called it a slave religion. It's a bunch of people who don't have power who band together to create power as a big group so they can take on, the sheep can take on the big hawks, the big eagles, right? At the end of the day, if God doesn't exist, then really it's just whatever society chooses. And if this society over here chooses to murder and abuse and that's okay to them, well, by their lights, it's okay. And you can't say anything otherwise. Power, at the end of the day, is the only thing that determines right, because you can enforce your perspective. But this idea of oughtness, the problem of evil isn't really a problem, not logically anyway, from the true sense, the academic sense of the term. But actually, I think it's more than that. I think it becomes something that points us to a deeper discussion about God and why we even struggle with evil, and we don't just go, hey, well, you do you, man, and I'll do me. There's something in us. The very fact that evil is a problem points to God. The very fact we even frame the discussion, but I thought God loved me, but there's bad in the world. Where does that sense come from? It points back to God. Now, we've talked possible, and people went, okay, thanks. Let me talk probable for a moment. This is where we exit a discussion of just could a God of some sort, somewhere, some brand, some type. Let's talk about the God of the Bible for a moment, because it becomes also a discussion, not just of moral oughtness and how it points to this implicit image of God in all of us, but there's actually a discussion about the character and nature of God. So why would we wrap our heads around and say it's not just possible, but probable that a good, all-loving God, all-powerful God would allow evil and suffering? Well, the Bible talks about it this way. First, from Matthew chapter 22, God is love. What do we mean by that? Jesus actually frames everything that we talk about within the whole Bible in this phrase. He summarizes it this. He gets asked a question, teacher, what is the most important of all the laws? What's the most central thing that this all boils down to? Well, what does he say? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. This is what it all boils down to for Jesus, is this offering of love. That offering requires free will. You ever had a Father's Day experience? This was not mine, right? But I remember some of my Father's Day experience. Sorry, Dad. Janelle said something to her dad. I'll say that to my dad. Happy Father's Day. Sorry. You know when those things were like your parents made you draw like a card, and you like had to go up, and you're like, Happy Father's Day, Dad. Love you. Here's your card. I do love to remind people the number one day of phone calls is Mother's Day. And back when we had them, the number one day nationally for collect phone calls was Father's Day, right? It's what it is, right? But this sort of like perfunctory, I need to do this. Or you ever had someone give you a birthday gift and they did it because they had to come, but they want to come for the party? Like when somebody has to love you, parents, do you ever make your kids hug it out after a fight? Kids are arguing, oh, go hug it out. And you're like trying to hug them and be like, I love you, Does that feel like love? To have a genuine expression of love requires the opportunity to reject. And it can't be true without it. If God's very character and nature, but notice the phrase is not God is loving, God is love. That's a different statement, by the way. And Jesus says, you know what this all boils down to? What God is really wanting from you. It's not, to serve, although that's great. It's not to give, although that's important. It's not to sing really loudly, although that can be a version of it. It boils down to this posture of the heart. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. There had to be free will for this to happen. So God is allowing people to choose because God desires a relationship with you that's based off of love, not robotic obedience, regardless of whatever pastors may say sometimes. The second thing, I think how this talks about the very heart and nature of God. Suffering has a purpose. See, we always view this as a negative thing, and there are negatives about it. I love that the book of Ruth does not sugarcoat, by the way, that this was awful. You ever had somebody that just totally dismisses your pain and it feels terrible, and you're like, I just got let go of work, and they're like, but hey, all things work together for good. And you just want to kind of punch them in love, you know? In love, it's okay, it's in love. It's in love. The book doesn't do that. In fact, that was the invitation last week. Actually turn and look. Face it. There's too much kind of, doing the ostrich, sticking your head in the sand. I can't even engage with that. That would be disrespectful. The book is very clear. This was awful. But it doesn't mean there's not a purpose. 2 Corinthians 4. I'd encourage you to read the whole chapter anyway, but here's just a snippet relevant for what we're saying here. 2 Corinthians 4 says this, so we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light and momentary affliction is preparing us for eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. See, suffering has a purpose. It actually does something to transform us. And the Bible is very surprising in this sense. One of the last lessons Jesus gave was actually in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he's going to come and he's going to name and emotionally respond to, not sugarcoat, that this cup that's coming, that he's going to use Old Testament imagery here, drink to the dregs, is something that just brings immense concern and this, fear over how is that going to feel? And there's just all sorts of emotions to the point where he's tearing up, he's sweating blood. He's in a very vulnerable place. You know what he actually tells his disciples? Hey, come and be here with me while I struggle with this. While I process this, while I ask God, is there any other way? While I shake. How many of you in a moment like that want a room full of people watching you? You know the experience when you cry and you immediately want to hide, right? And Jesus actually says, I want you to watch me. How bizarre is that? Because it's a lesson that all of them are going to have to process. How do I see this cup of suffering that God puts in front of me, that maybe even he asked me to drink? What do I do with that? There's something in the character and nature of God that says this suffering, it has a purpose. Now, as the worship team comes up, let me end on this. There's possible, that's our logic fun, for those of you who care. There's probable. This is actually a little bit more of how Scripture paints this about God's character, God's nature. And there's meaningful. Let me end on the meaningful here. And I'll end this from a story in Genesis chapter 18. I had a mother standing in my office, pacing back and forth. Tragedy had happened. And she was just almost not even talking to me like I wasn't in the room. Just going, why? 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 What do you say in those moments? You talk about what's possible? Oh, well, I learned that lesson. Well, probable. Let me tell you about the character and the nature. Man, that's a hard time to sling a Bible verse at anybody, okay? Why? 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 Do you want to read the book of Job? It's a long book, by the way. The book asks this question over and over. Why? 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 Do you know God never answers? In the entire book, he never answers. And people look at me and they go, Brian, you're a pastor. Tell me why. The hard truth is, friends, I don't know. And you probably won't either. Not on this side of the veil of eternity. One day, I believe you'll see it. Maybe you'll get glimpses of it as time goes on. But what do you do in the meantime? Because your life is in the meantime. I like the story in Genesis 18. It's a story of Abraham. And Abraham is entreating with some angelic beings. And there's this conversation that comes up about Sodom. And the angels say, God is going to bring destruction on Sodom. I love, by the way, that Abraham's heart here is not to cheer it on, but to actually say, God, would you bring mercy? And he goes into this whole very ancient Near Eastern, like negotiating tactic with God. God, based off of who you are and who your character is, what I know to be true about you, what if there's righteous people there too? And you wouldn't want to sweep them up. God, what if there's 50? Would you save the city? And God says, okay, Abraham, for 50, I'll do it. Abraham goes, thank you, God. I have another question. What about for 40? He goes, okay, all right, fine, 40, I'll do it. He goes, oh, good, because I was going to also ask, what about 30? Right? He's like a car salesman here, right? He's talking him down. He goes from 50 to 40 to 30 to 20 to 10. God, if there's 10, would you be merciful? And the angels walk away. What's God going to do? What's going to happen? He doesn't know. But there's this phrase tucked in there that I think is instructive for all of us. In the lack of knowing what's going to happen, in the midst of all the why, there's this beautiful little verse where Abraham says, will not the judge of all the earth do what's right? So I'm looking at that mom, pacing back and forth. Why? I don't know. But I can't tell you what I do know. Will not the judge of all the earth do what's right? I don't know what's right. In the grand scheme of it all, I don't know. But I believe God will do what's right. And in the gap, I'm going to trust. This is why we reflect on St. Anselm's view of how we interpret the world is this: faith seeking understanding. Friends, to process tragedy, we got to get past the why and maybe settle our hearts on the who. That's actually how the book of Job ends. I'm not going to tell you why, Job, but I'm going to tell you who I am, my character. And then I want you to trust. From a position of faith, we seek understanding, not the other way around. Will not the judge of all the earth do what's right? Father in heaven, for our own whys, for the whys of those who are close around us, God, give us faith. Faith that doesn't deny the desire or the search for understanding. But Father, a faith that endures, that can endure through the unknowns, through the lack of answers, through the pain and through the tragedy. Would you give us a faith that overcomes, a faith that seeks the understanding, and in the time that we start and until it's concluded, God, may we trust in the who, believing that you are good. Would you bring us to the shores of heaven, safe and sound? For we place our trust not in chariots, not in horses, not in our own strength, our own intelligence, because, Father, we trust in you. We ask this in the name of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. And all God's people said, amen.